the first time Marshal Cade Emerson saw Josephine Morgan. She was standing in front of the general store in Eureka, Nevada, looking at a poster for a traveling show with such hollow eyes that he wondered if she even saw what was before her. It was the summer of 1882, and the silver mining town was bustling with prospectors and gamblers and dreamers, but this woman stood apart from all of them like a ghost among the living, her black mourning dress stark against the dusty wooden storefront. Cade had been Marshal for 3 years now, ever since he'd hung up his days of drifting and decided Eureka needed someone who could keep the peace without being in the pocket of the mine owners. At 32, he'd seen enough of the West to know when someone was carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear alone. The woman's face, though young and fine featured beneath her bonnet, held no expression whatsoever. No sadness, no curiosity, no hope, just emptiness. He tipped his hat as he passed. "Morning, madam." She turned to look at him, and for a moment their eyes met. Hers were the color of storm clouds, gray and distant. She nodded once, a mechanical movement, then returned her attention to the poster without a word. Cade went about his business that day, breaking up a fight between 2 miners at the Lucky Strike Saloon and checking in with the bank to make sure their new shipment of currency had arrived safely. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman in black. That evening, as he sat in his office going over paperwork, he asked his deputy, a young man named Thomas Wright, if he knew anything about her. "That's Mrs. Morgan," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. "Widow. Her husband and little girl died of fever last winter within 3 days of each other. She's been living above the seamstress shop ever since, doing mending and alterations. Keeps to herself mostly. I've never heard her speak more than 2 words together." "How old was the child?" "4, I think." "Maybe 5. Thomas shook his head. "Terrible thing. They say Mrs. Morgan hasn't been quite right since. Not crazy, mind you, just empty." Cade felt something twist in his chest. He knew what grief could do to a person. He'd lost his own brother to a gunfight years ago, watched his mother fade away from sorrow afterward. But he'd never seen anyone look quite as hollowed out as Josephine Morgan had looked standing on that street. Over the next few days, he found himself noticing her around town. She moved through Eureka like a shadow, appearing at the market early in the morning before most folks were awake, picking up fabric from the freight office, returning to her small room above the shop. She never smiled, never frowned. Her face remained as blank as fresh paper, and he never once heard her voice. It bothered him more than it should have. Cade had always been the type to help where help was needed, but this felt different. This felt like something pulling at him, demanding his attention in a way he couldn't quite explain. On the 4th day after he'd first seen her, he was walking past the seamstress shop when he heard a crash from the alley beside it. He drew his pistol by instinct and moved quickly around the corner, only to find Josephine standing amid a pile of broken crates that had apparently fallen from their stack against the wall. She was staring down at them with that same blank expression, making no move to clean up the mess or step away from the debris. "You all right, madam?" Cade asked, holstering his weapon. She looked up at him slowly, as if coming back from somewhere far away. "Yes." Her voice was quiet, colorless. She bent to start picking up the broken wood, her movements mechanical and efficient. Cade crouched down to help her, stacking the pieces that might still be useful and pushing aside those that were too splintered. "These fell on you?" he asked. "No, I bumped them." They worked in silence for a few minutes. Cade tried to think of something to say, something that might bring a flicker of life to those dead eyes, but everything that came to mind seemed either too cheerful or too pitying. Finally, he settled on simple truth. "I'm sorry about your family, Mrs. Morgan. I heard what happened." Her hands stilled for just a moment, then continued their work. "Thank you." That was all. No tears, no trembling voice, no visible reaction at all. It was like watching someone who had learned to perform the motions of living without actually feeling any of it. They finished cleaning up the alley and Josephine stood, brushing dust from her black skirts. "I appreciate your help, Marshal." She turned to go, but something made Cade speak again. "Madam, when's the last time you had a proper meal? Not just bread and coffee, I mean. Real food." She paused, considering the question with apparent seriousness. "I don't recall. The hotel dining room serves a decent roast on Saturday nights. Would you allow me to take you to dinner this weekend?" He wasn't sure why he'd asked. It came out of his mouth before he'd fully thought it through. But now that the words were in the air between them, he found he meant them. Josephine looked at him with those gray eyes, studying his face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Why?" "Because everyone needs to eat, and it seems to me you might not be taking proper care of yourself." "I eat enough to function." "That's not the same as taking care of yourself, madam." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in that same flat voice, "All right, Saturday." Cade felt an unexpected surge of satisfaction. "6 o'clock. I'll meet you here." She nodded once and disappeared into the shop, leaving him standing in the alley wondering what exactly he'd just gotten himself into. Saturday came hot and dry, the way Nevada summers always did. Cade put on his cleanest shirt and brushed the dust from his vest, feeling foolish for caring so much about his appearance. This wasn't courting, he told himself. This was just making sure a grieving widow didn't waste away from neglect. But when Josephine emerged from the seamstress shop at precisely 6 o'clock, something in his chest tightened. She was still wearing black, of course, but she'd done something different with her hair, pinning it up in a way that showed the graceful line of her neck. She was beautiful, he realized. Heartbreakingly beautiful, in the way of things that had been broken and not quite put back together. They walked to the hotel in silence. Cade found himself acutely aware of the space between them, the way she moved with careful precision, as if she'd forgotten how to do anything without thinking about it first. The dining room was half full with miners and their families, shopkeepers and traveling salesmen. Cade led Josephine to a table by the window and held out her chair. She sat with that same mechanical grace, folding her hands in her lap and looking at the menu without apparent interest. "The roast beef is good," Cade offered, "and they make decent potatoes. That's fine." When the waiter came, Cade ordered for both of them, adding a bottle of wine because it seemed like the right thing to do. Josephine didn't protest. She simply sat there, looking out the window at the street beyond, her face unreadable. "How long have you been doing seamstress work?" Cade asked, trying to start some kind of conversation. "Since February." "You like it?" "It keeps me occupied." He tried again. "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri, St. Louis." "That's a big change coming out here. My husband wanted to try mining." Her voice remained flat, devoid of emotion. "He thought we'd strike it rich." A lot of men think that. A lot of men are wrong. The wine arrived and Cade poured them each a glass. Josephine picked hers up and took a small sip, her expression never changing. It was like dining with a porcelain doll, beautiful but lifeless. The food came and they ate in near silence. Cade kept trying to draw her into conversation, asking questions about her work, about Eureka, about anything he could think of. She answered each one with the minimum number of words possible, never volunteering information, never asking anything in return. It should have been uncomfortable. It should have made him want to end the evening early and escape back to the familiar comfort of his office. But instead, Cade found himself more determined than ever. Somewhere under all that grief and emptiness, there was a real person. There had to be, and he wanted to find her. "Mrs. Morgan," he said finally, setting down his fork. Can I tell you something? She looked at him with those storm-gray eyes. If you wish. I don't think you've forgotten how to feel. I think you're just scared to try. For the first time since he'd met her, something flickered across her face. It was gone so quickly he almost missed it, but it had been there. A crack in the armor. You don't know anything about me, Marshal, she said quietly. No, madam, I don't. But I know what grief looks like. I know what it does to people. And I know that the ones who survive it are the ones who decide to keep living instead of just existing. My daughter was 5 years old. The words came out barely above a whisper. She liked to collect pretty rocks. She would line them up on the windowsill and give them names. When the fever took her, she asked me why I couldn't make her better, and I had no answer. And then my husband, he just gave up. He stopped fighting. And I sat there between their beds and watched them both die, and I couldn't do anything. Cade's throat tightened. He reached across the table slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't move, he placed his hand over hers. Her skin was cold. That's not your fault, he said. I know that here. She touched her forehead with her free hand. But I don't feel it here. She touched her chest. I don't feel anything here anymore. It's just empty. And I don't know if I want to feel again, Marshal. Because if I start feeling, I'll have to feel all of it. All the pain I've been keeping locked away, and I don't know if I can survive that. You can, Cade said with certainty. You're stronger than you think. How do you know? Because you're still here. You're still getting up every morning and doing the work and putting one foot in front of the other. That takes strength, Mrs. Morgan. More strength than most people have. She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at their joined hands. Then she slowly pulled away, folding her hands back in her lap. But when she looked at him again, something in her eyes was different. Not alive, not yet, but not quite as dead as before. Thank you for dinner, Marshal, she said. I should be getting back. Cade paid the bill and walked her home through the cooling evening air. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. When they reached the seamstress shop, Josephine paused at the door. Marshal Emerson, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his name. I didn't forget laughter. I'm afraid of it. I'm afraid that if I laugh or smile or feel any joy at all, it means I'm forgetting them, that I'm leaving them behind. Cade felt something break open in his chest. He understood now, really understood what he was dealing with. This wasn't just grief. This was guilt. Mrs. Morgan, he said gently. Your family wouldn't want you to live like this. They'd want you to be happy. You don't know that. Yes, I do, because if you loved them, they loved you too. And nobody who loves someone wants them to suffer. She looked at him for a long moment, and he thought he saw the shimmer of tears in her eyes, but she blinked them away before they could fall. Good night, Marshal. Good night, madam. He watched her climb the stairs to her room above the shop, and he made himself a promise. He was going to make Josephine Morgan laugh again. He didn't know how, and he didn't know how long it would take, but he was going to do it. The next morning, Cade stopped by the general store and bought a small package of hard candy, the kind that came in bright colors and tasted like fruit. He left it on the step outside the seamstress shop before dawn, with no note, no explanation. The day after that, he left a pretty stone he'd found by the creek, smooth and gray and streaked with white, like the ones her daughter used to collect. On the third day, he left a wildflower he'd picked from the meadow outside town, something yellow and cheerful that refused to wilt despite the heat. He never waited to see her reaction. He just left his small offerings and went about his day, hoping that somewhere in that broken heart something was beginning to stir. A week passed before he saw her again. He was making his evening rounds when she stepped out of the shadowed doorway of the shop, startling him. Marshal Emerson. Mrs. Morgan. He touched his hat brim. Everything all right? I know it's you leaving things. He didn't bother denying it. Hope that's all right. Why are you doing this? Because everyone deserves to know that someone's thinking about them. She wrapped her arms around herself, despite the warmth of the evening. I don't understand you. Nothing to understand, madam. I just think you deserve better than what you're giving yourself. You don't know me well enough to think anything about what I deserve. Then let me get to know you better. The words came out before he could stop them. Take a walk with me tomorrow evening, just around town. No dinner, no expectations, just a walk. Marshal, I can't or won't. She opened her mouth, closed it again. He could see her struggling, could see the war happening behind those gray eyes. Finally, she said, won't. That's all right too, but the offer stands whenever you're ready. He tipped his hat and started to move past her, but her voice stopped him. Marshal, the stone. The gray one with the white stripes. Yes, madam. It looks like one Emily would have loved. That's what we named her. Emily. It was the first time he'd heard her speak her daughter's name. Cade turned back to face her and saw that her eyes were wet, tears finally spilling over onto her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She just stood there, crying silently in the twilight. Emily's a beautiful name, he said softly. She was a beautiful child, so full of life, so happy. She used to laugh at everything. Her father would make silly faces and she'd laugh until she couldn't breathe. And I'd laugh too, watching them together. We were happy, Marshal. We were so happy. And now they're gone, and I can't remember what my own laughter sounded like. Cade closed the distance between them slowly, carefully. Then we'll find it again together. Why do you care so much, honestly? I don't rightly know, but I do. And I'm not going to stop caring just because it's inconvenient or confusing. Josephine looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something that wasn't emptiness or pain in her expression. It was something softer, more uncertain, something that might have been the beginning of hope. I'll walk with you tomorrow, she said quietly. But I can't promise anything beyond that. Don't need promises, madam, just your company. The next evening, Cade found himself more nervous than he'd been in years. He'd faced down armed outlaws with steadier hands than this. But when Josephine emerged from the shop wearing a dress that was still black, but somehow less severe, with her hair loosely pinned and her face freshly washed, his heart hammered in his chest like he was 16 years old again. They walked through Eureka as the evening shadows lengthened, past the saloons and the general store, past the bank and the assay office. Cade pointed out various landmarks and told her stories about the town, about the time a prospector's mule had gotten drunk on fermented apples and terrorized Main Street, about the traveling preacher who turned out to be running a con game, about the winter when the snow had piled so high they'd had to dig tunnels between buildings. Josephine listened, and though she didn't smile, she seemed to relax slightly. Her shoulders lost some of their rigid tension, and she asked occasional questions in that quiet voice of hers. How did you become a marshal? She asked as they turned onto a less traveled street. Sort of fell into it. I was drifting through town 3 years back, and there was trouble brewing between the miners and the railroad men. The old marshal had died of a heart attack, and nobody wanted the job because it meant making enemies of one side or the other. I helped settle things without anyone getting killed, and the town council asked me to stay on. You don't seem like the drifting type. I wasn't always. Used to have a ranch in Montana, worked it with my brother. But he was killed in a stupid fight over a card game, and after that, I couldn't stay. Too many memories. So you understand, she said softly. I understand running from pain, but I also understand that you can't run forever. Eventually, you have to stop and figure out how to live with it. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps echoing off the wooden storefronts. The evening was cooling down, a slight breeze carrying the scent of sage from the desert beyond town. I used to love to laugh, Josephine said suddenly. Before, I laughed easily at small things. A joke, a kitten, a silly story. But now, when I think about laughing, it feels wrong, like I'd be betraying them somehow. What if you're betraying them by not laughing? Cade asked gently. What if the real betrayal is letting their deaths kill your joy forever? She stopped walking and turned to face him. In the fading light, her eyes looked darker, deeper. You really believe that? I do. And I think deep down you do too. Otherwise you wouldn't be here with me right now. I don't know what I believe anymore, Marshal. I feel like I'm lost in a fog and I can't find my way out. Then let me help guide you. He held out his hand, palm up, not grabbing, just offering. You don't have to do this alone, Josephine. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She looked down at his hand, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. All right, she whispered. From that evening on, they walked together every day. Cade made it his mission to show Josephine that the world still held things worth experiencing, even if they didn't make her laugh yet. He took her to see the sunset from the hill behind the church, where the desert stretched out in endless waves of purple and gold. He brought her to the creek where wildflowers grew, their colors impossibly bright against the gray sage. He introduced her to a stray dog that had adopted him, a scruffy mutt named Rufus, who had no dignity whatsoever and loved everyone unconditionally. Josephine remained quiet through it all, watching and listening but never quite participating. But Cade was patient. He'd learned patience in his years as a lawman, learned that some things couldn't be rushed. 2 weeks into their daily walks, Cade decided to try something different. He showed up at the seamstress shop carrying a basket. What's that? Josephine asked when she emerged. Picnic supplies. Thought we'd head out of town for a bit if you're willing. She hesitated, and he could see the wariness in her eyes. Going out of town meant going further from the safety of familiar routines. Just to the cottonwood grove by the creek, he said. Not far, and I promise we'll be back before dark. All right, she said finally. They walked out past the edge of Eureka, where the buildings gave way to open desert, and the cottonwood trees clustered near the thin stream of water that fed the town. Cade spread out a blanket in the shade and unpacked the basket, pulling out bread and cheese and cold chicken, along with a jar of lemonade he'd sweet-talked the hotel cook into making. Josephine sat down carefully, smoothing her skirts. This is nice. Sometimes it helps to get away from town. All those people, all those eyes. Out here, it's just us and the desert. They ate in comfortable silence, and Cade noticed that Josephine actually seemed to taste the food this time, rather than just mechanically chewing and swallowing. When she reached for the lemonade and took a sip, her eyes widened slightly. This is good, she said, surprised. Mrs. Henderson makes it special. Won't tell anyone her recipe. It's sweet but not too sweet, and there's something else in it. Mint and a little vanilla, I think. But she'd never confirm it. Josephine took another sip, and Cade watched as some of the tension drained from her face. She looked almost peaceful sitting there under the cottonwoods, dappled sunlight playing across her features. Can I ask you something, Josephine? He'd taken to using her first name, and she'd never objected. Yes. What was your favorite thing about being a mother? He saw her stiffen, but he kept his voice gentle, his expression open. After a moment, she answered the questions. Emily asked questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Where do stars go in the daytime? Do ants have names for each other? And I didn't always have answers, but I loved that she wanted to know, that she looked at the world with such wonder. She sounds like she was something special. She was. She really was. Josephine's voice cracked slightly. And I'm terrified I'm going to forget. Forget the exact sound of her voice or the way she smelled after a bath or how her hand felt in mine. I'm already forgetting, and it hasn't even been a year." "You won't forget the important things," Cade said. "The love doesn't fade just because the details get fuzzy around the edges." "How can you know that?" "Because I still love my brother, even though I can't quite remember if his eyes were more green or more brown. Love isn't in the details, it's in here." He touched his chest. "And nothing can take that away." Josephine looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she said, "You're a kind man, Marshal Cade Emerson. Kinder than you probably should be, spending all this time on a broken widow." "You're not broken, you're healing. There's a difference." "I don't feel like I'm healing." "Healing isn't something you feel while it's happening. It's something you notice afterward, when you realize the wound doesn't hurt quite as much as it used to." They finished their picnic and lay back on the blanket, looking up through the cottonwood leaves at the blue sky beyond. Cade pointed out cloud shapes, trying to get Josephine to see dragons and castles and sailing ships. She didn't quite engage with the game, but she watched the clouds drift past with something that might have been interest. "There," Cade said, pointing. "That one looks like a chicken wearing a hat." Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It looks more like a hat that ate a chicken." It wasn't a joke, not really, but it was playful in a subtle way. Cade grinned. "You might be right about that." "I'm definitely right. Look at the shape of the brim. That's guilt. That hat knows what it did." And there it was again, that tiny spark of something that wasn't grief or emptiness. Cade felt hope bloom in his chest like one of those bright wildflowers. As the weeks passed and summer deepened, Cade noticed small changes in Josephine. She started meeting his eyes more often when they talked. She asked questions instead of just answering his. She chose her own destinations for their walks instead of letting him decide everything. And slowly, painfully slowly, color started to return to her world. One evening in late July, Cade arrived at the seamstress shop to find Josephine wearing a dress that was dark blue instead of black. It was still subdued, still appropriate for mourning, but it wasn't the stark absence of color she'd worn for months. "That's a nice dress," he said, trying not to make too much of it. "I thought it might be time," she said quietly. "Not to forget, just to acknowledge that life continues." "That's real brave of you, Josephine." "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified, like I'm doing something wrong." "You're not. You're doing something incredibly right." They walked to the creek that evening, and Josephine was quieter than usual. Cade let her have her silence, understanding that she was processing something important. When they reached the water, she stood on the bank for a long time, just looking at the thin stream flowing over the rocks. "Tell me something funny," she said finally. "Something that happened to you." Cade thought for a moment, then said, "All right. This was about 5 years back when I was working on a ranch in Colorado. We had this rooster named Napoleon, meanest damn bird you ever saw. He'd attack anyone who came near the chicken coop, spurs first, no warning. Well, one morning I was collecting eggs, and Napoleon decided I was his mortal enemy. Came at me like a tiny feathered demon. I backed up so fast I tripped over a bucket, fell right into the water trough. Sat there soaking wet while Napoleon strutted around like he'd won a war." He paused, gauging her reaction. Josephine's lips twitched slightly. "The worst part was," Cade continued, "the ranch owner's daughter saw the whole thing. Pretty girl, about 19. I'd been trying to work up the courage to ask if I could court her. After that, she called me Napoleon's nemesis for the rest of the time I worked there. Completely killed any romantic prospects." Josephine's lips twitched again, a little more this time. "The rooster ruined your love life. Thoroughly and completely. I left that ranch with my dignity in tatters and my pride pecked to pieces." This time, Josephine made a small sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, more like a quiet exhale that might have contained humor. But her eyes were brighter than Cade had ever seen them, and the corners of her mouth had definitely lifted. "That's terrible," she said, and there was something almost light in her voice. "It gets worse. When I finally did leave, the ranch owner gave me a going-away present." Want to guess what it was? I couldn't possibly. "A painting of Napoleon. Hung it with great ceremony in the bunkhouse with a little plaque that said undefeated champion. The other ranch hands wouldn't let me forget it." Josephine pressed her lips together and Cade could see her fighting something. Her shoulders shook slightly. She brought her hand up to cover her mouth, and then she laughed. It was small, barely more than a breath, quickly stifled. But it was definitely a laugh. Real, genuine, involuntary amusement. Josephine's eyes went wide with shock. She lowered her hand slowly, staring at Cade as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. "I laughed," she whispered. "You did." "I just laughed at a story about a rooster. A very dignified and serious rooster, I'll have you know." Her hand flew back to her mouth, and this time the laugh was a little louder, a little longer. Then her eyes filled with tears, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, her whole body shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed. Cade stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, letting her sob against his chest while those small laughs kept bubbling up between the tears. He held her while she purged months of grief and guilt and fear, his hand stroking her back, murmuring wordless comfort. When she finally quieted, she didn't pull away immediately. She stayed there in his embrace, her face pressed against his shirt, breathing in shaky gasps. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice muffled. "Nothing to be sorry for. I got your shirt all wet. I've been wetter. Remember Napoleon and the water trough?" She let out a watery sound that might have been another laugh. "You did that on purpose, the story. I told you a true story. If it happened to make you laugh, well, that was just good fortune." Josephine finally pulled back enough to look up at him. Her face was blotchy and tear-stained, her eyes red and puffy. She'd never looked more beautiful to him. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me." "Wasn't about to," Cade said. "Made myself a mission, remember, to hear you laugh. Just took a little longer than I expected." "Why did you make it your mission, really? You could have spent your time on anything, anyone. Why a broken widow who could barely string two words together?" Cade reached up and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Because from the first moment I saw you, I knew you were worth the effort. Because something in me recognized something in you. And because I'm falling in love with you, Josephine Morgan, and I have been since the day I asked you to dinner." Her breath caught. "Cade, I'm not asking you to love me back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'm just telling you the truth. And the truth is, I want to spend every day trying to make you laugh, to make you smile, to help you remember that joy is still possible. Not because I expect anything in return, but because you deserve it." Josephine stared at him, her gray eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she reached up and touched his jaw, her fingers gentle against his skin. "I don't know if I can love again," she said quietly. "I don't know if I have anything left to give. Then we'll find out together. No pressure, no expectations, just us, taking it one day at a time." She nodded, and something in her expression shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was possibility. And that was enough. From that day forward, things changed between them. Josephine started smiling more often, small, cautious expressions that lit up her face like sunrise. She talked about Emily and her husband without that terrible flatness in her voice, sharing memories that were bittersweet but no longer purely painful. And she laughed, quietly at first, then more freely, at Cade's stories and jokes and observations. But it wasn't just Cade making Josephine laugh. She started finding her own humor again, making dry observations about the people and situations around them. Her wit was subtle and unexpected, catching Cade off guard in the best possible way. "Mrs. Henderson was in the shop today," Josephine said one evening as they walked through town. "She wanted me to alter a dress to make it more fashionable, said she wanted to look modern." "That's so. The dress was from 1865. I told her I could make it fashionable for 1870 if she wanted, but modern might be a bridge too far," Cade grinned. "What did she say?" "She said 1870 would be just fine, as long as it was scandalous 1870. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I'm adding ruffles. Scandalous ruffles. The most scandalous ruffles Nevada has ever seen." They laughed together, and Cade marveled at how natural it was becoming. How Josephine's face came alive when she was amused, how her eyes sparkled with mischief. As August arrived with its blistering heat, Cade realized that what he felt for Josephine had deepened into something profound. It wasn't just attraction or affection. It was love, real and true, the kind that wanted nothing more than the other person's happiness. But he was patient. He didn't push, didn't press for more than she was ready to give. They continued their walks, their picnics, their long conversations about everything and nothing. And slowly, he watched Josephine bloom back into herself. One evening in mid-August, they were sitting on the hill behind the church watching the sunset when Josephine said, "I've been thinking." "Dangerous occupation," Cade teased. She smiled, then turned serious. "I've been thinking about what you said, about love not being in the details, about it being something that stays even when memories fade. All right. I think you were right, because when I think about my family now, it hurts less. The love is still there, but the pain isn't quite so sharp. And I don't feel guilty anymore for laughing or smiling or enjoying a sunset." "That's good, Josephine. That's real good. And I've been thinking about something else too." She turned to look at him, and there was something new in her eyes, something warm and uncertain and brave. "I've been thinking about you." Cade's heart started beating faster. "Yeah, about how patient you've been, how kind, how you made it your mission to help me find my laughter again, and you never gave up, even when I gave you no reason to hope. You gave me plenty of reason. You showed up every day, you kept trying, that was enough." "I want to try something more," Josephine said softly, "if you're willing." "What's that?" Instead of answering, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was tentative and sweet, barely more than a brush of lips. But it sent warmth flooding through Cade's entire body. He cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her back, careful not to push too hard or too fast, letting her set the pace. When they broke apart, Josephine was smiling. Really smiling, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and made her face radiant. "Was that all right?" she asked, suddenly shy. "That was perfect," Cade said. "You're perfect. I'm still grieving. I'm still figuring out how to live again, but I think I'm ready to try doing it with you. If you'll have me." "Josephine Morgan, I'd be honored." She laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound Cade had ever heard. Not because it was musical or special in any objective way, but because it was hers, freely given, full of genuine happiness. They sat on that hill as the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to appear, talking about the future for the first time. Careful, tentative plans. No rush, no pressure. Just possibilities stretching out before them like the desert itself, vast and full of promise. The next few months were a revelation. Cade and Josephine courted properly, with all the attention and respect that deserved. They continued their daily walks, but now they held hands, fingers intertwined. They shared meals at the hotel, and Josephine actually participated in conversations with others, her quiet voice becoming more confident. They went to church socials together, and Cade felt a fierce pride when he saw how the town began to respond to the changes in her. Josephine laughed more often now, sometimes at Cade's jokes, sometimes at things she noticed herself. She started wearing colors beyond black and dark blue, soft greens and grays, and even a dress in pale yellow that made her look like sunshine. Her eyes lost that haunted quality, replacing it with something warmer, more alive, and Cade fell deeper in love with every passing day, with her intelligence and her subtle humor, with the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, with her growing confidence and the gradual return of her joy. With all of it, all of her. In September, Cade took Josephine back to the Cottonwood Grove for another picnic. But this time, he'd brought something special. When they finished eating, he pulled a small box from his pocket. "Josephine," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness in his chest. "I know we haven't been courting long, not officially, and I know you're still healing. But I also know that I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you laugh and making you happy, if you'll let me." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest but genuine. Josephine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. "Cade, will you marry me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. They were something else entirely. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Cade slipped the ring onto her finger, and then she was in his arms, kissing him with more passion than she'd ever shown before. They held each other under the cottonwood trees, laughing and crying and making promises for the future. They were married in October, when the heat had finally broken and the desert air turned crisp and clear. It was a simple ceremony at the church, with the whole town in attendance. Josephine wore a dress of pale blue silk that she'd made herself, and Cade wore his Sunday best with his Marshal star polished to a shine. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Cade kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause. And Josephine laughed, bright and free, her face glowing with happiness. The reception was held at the hotel, and for the first time since losing her family, Josephine danced. Cade waltzed her around the room while the town fiddler played, and she smiled up at him with so much love that he thought his heart might burst. "Thank you," she said as they moved together. "For what? For not letting me disappear, for bringing me back to life." "You did that yourself, Josephine. I just reminded you it was possible. You did more than that. You gave me a reason to try. You gave me hope when I thought it was gone forever." "You gave me something too," Cade said. "You gave me a purpose. A reason to believe that good things can happen, even in hard times." They moved together in comfortable silence for a moment, then Josephine said, "I'm not afraid anymore." "Of what?" "Of being happy, of loving you, of starting over. I'm not afraid." Cade pulled her closer. "Good. Because I plan on making you laugh every single day for the rest of our lives." "That's a bold promise, Marshal." "I'm a bold man, Mrs. Emerson." She laughed at that, and he grinned, filing away the sound in his memory along with all the other times he'd heard her laugh. Each one was precious, a small victory over grief and loss. After the wedding, they moved into a small house on the edge of town, a 2-bedroom place with a porch and a yard where wildflowers grew. Josephine continued her seamstress work, but now she did it from home, and Cade stopped by throughout the day to check on her and steal kisses. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Cade kept the peace in Eureka, breaking up fights and tracking down the occasional horse thief. Josephine sewed and mended and created beautiful garments for the town's residents. And together, they built a life full of laughter and love. It wasn't always easy. Josephine still had hard days when the grief rose up unexpectedly, triggered by a child's laughter or a glimpse of a particular shade of blonde hair. But Cade was there through all of it, holding her when she needed to cry, listening when she needed to talk, making her laugh when she needed joy. And she did the same for him. When his old memories of his brother surfaced, when the weight of his responsibilities felt too heavy, Josephine was there with her quiet strength and her unexpected humor, reminding him why life was worth living. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of happiness. They celebrated their first Christmas together with a tree decorated with paper ornaments and strings of popcorn. They welcomed the new year of 1883 with a kiss on their porch, watching fireworks light up the Nevada sky. They worked and played and loved each other with increasing devotion. In March, Josephine started feeling unwell in the mornings. At first, Cade worried that she was ill, but when she went to see the doctor, she came home with news that made them both cry happy tears. She was pregnant. Cade immediately became overprotective, trying to do everything for her. Josephine found this both sweet and exasperating. "I'm having a baby, not dying of consumption," she said one evening when he tried to prevent her from lifting a basket of laundry. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "I know, but I want to make sure you're safe, both of you." She softened at that and pulled him down for a kiss. "We're fine, better than fine, we're wonderful." But Cade could see the fear lurking behind her brave words. The memory of losing Emily was still fresh enough to cast shadows on this new joy. So he made it his mission to keep her spirits up, to make her laugh even when she was tired and nauseated and uncomfortable. He told her terrible jokes and made ridiculous faces and recounted every amusing incident from his day. He brought her wildflowers and pretty stones, and once, memorably, a very ugly hat he'd confiscated from a drunk who'd been using it to fight off imaginary dragons. "This is the silliest hat I've ever seen," Josephine said, examining the battered felt monstrosity with its broken feathers and mysterious stains. "I thought you could use it in your sewing, maybe cut it apart for material. What would I make from this?" "A saddle blanket for a very small, very unfortunate horse." Cade laughed so hard he had to sit down. "You're getting better at this than me." "I learned from the best," she said, grinning. As her pregnancy progressed through spring and into summer, Josephine bloomed. She grew round and radiant, her face glowing with health and happiness. And she laughed often, sometimes at Cade's antics, sometimes at her own observations about the absurdities of carrying a child. "This baby has decided my bladder is a toy," she announced one morning. "I've been to the outhouse 5 times already and it's not even noon. Want me to move the outhouse closer to the house?" "That's not how outhouses work, Cade. I could dig a new one, right next to the porch. Our property would smell delightful. Sacrifice for comfort." She threw a pillow at him, laughing, and he caught it with exaggerated surprise. These moments of playful domesticity filled Cade with contentment so deep it almost scared him. He'd never imagined he could be this happy. In September, as the summer heat began to fade, Josephine went into labor. It was long and difficult, and Cade paced outside their bedroom door for hours while the midwife and doctor worked. He'd faced armed men without this much fear, but the thought of losing Josephine paralyzed him with terror. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, he heard the thin wail of a baby. Then Josephine's voice, weak but clear, calling his name. He burst into the room to find his wife propped up in bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. The midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, gave him a disapproving look. "You could knock," she said. "I'm sorry, Cade couldn't finish the sentence. He moved to Josephine's side and looked down at the baby in her arms, his son. He had a son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face, and he was making small, mewling sounds of complaint. He was the most beautiful thing Cade had ever seen, aside from his wife. "Meet your papa," Josephine said softly, her voice full of wonder. "Meet Matthew Cade Emerson." "Matthew," Cade whispered. His throat was so tight he could barely speak. "That's perfect. I thought we could call him Matt." Or Maddie when he's small? Cade sat on the edge of the bed and carefully took his son into his arms. Matthew's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and dark, before closing again. His tiny hand curled around Cade's finger with surprising strength. "Hello, Matthew," Cade said. "I'm your pa, and I promise to do everything I can to make you happy and keep you safe." Josephine reached over and took Cade's hand. "And I promise to teach you to laugh, just like your papa taught me." Tears ran down Cade's face as he looked between his wife and his son. A year and a half ago, Josephine had been a ghost, empty and afraid. Now she was vibrantly alive, a mother again, full of hope and love. "I love you," he said to her. "I love you so much. I love you too. Thank you for not giving up on me. Never could have, never would have." Matthew let out a cry, and Josephine laughed, taking the baby back to nurse. Cade watched them together, his heart so full he thought it might overflow. The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Matthew was a good baby, mostly, though he had strong opinions about when he should eat and sleep. Josephine took to motherhood with a joy tempered by experience, loving her son fiercely while also acknowledging her lingering grief for Emily. "Is it wrong that I still miss her?" she asked Cade one night as they lay in bed, Matthew asleep in his cradle nearby. "Even though I have Matthew now, of course not. Love doesn't replace love. You can love Matthew completely and still miss Emily. They're not in competition. I wish she could have met him. She would have been such a good big sister." "She would have been," Cade agreed. "But maybe in some way she knows about him. Maybe she's watching over him." "You believe that?" "I want to, and I think it's as likely as anything else." Josephine was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad our children will never wonder if they're loved. I'm glad they'll grow up with laughter in the house." "Children, plural," she smiled in the darkness. "Well, we can't just stop at one. Matthew needs brothers and sisters." "How many are we talking about here?" "I don't know. Let's just see what happens." What happened was that 2 years later they welcomed a daughter named Grace. She had Josephine's gray eyes and Cade's stubborn chin, and she ruled the household from the moment she arrived. Matthew adored her, bringing her toys and rocks and once, memorably, a very confused lizard he'd caught in the yard. Cade added onto the house, building extra bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Josephine expanded her seamstress business, taking on an apprentice to help with the workload. And together, they raised their children with laughter and love and patience. Cade kept his promise. Not a day went by when he didn't make Josephine laugh, whether with a silly joke or a funny observation, or simply the faces he made while playing with their children. And Josephine, who had once been afraid she'd forgotten how to laugh, found that joy came easily now. It bubbled up naturally, sparked by her husband's love and her children's antics, and the simple pleasure of being alive. The years passed swiftly. Matthew grew into a serious boy who loved books and asked endless questions, much like Emily once had. Grace was wild and fearless, climbing trees and racing through town like a small tornado. When she was 4, they welcomed another son, David, who was quiet and thoughtful and had an uncanny ability to calm crying babies and spooked horses. Cade eventually retired from being Marshal, training his deputy Thomas to take over the role. He bought a small ranch outside town where they raised horses and cattle, and where the children could run free in the wide open spaces. Josephine continued sewing, but she also started teaching, showing young women in Eureka how to make their own clothes and support themselves. She became known for her kindness and her quiet strength, and for the way she could make even the most difficult situations feel manageable. But more than anything, she was known for her laughter. The women who worked with her talked about how Mrs. Emerson could find humor in anything, how her laughter was infectious and warm, how being around her made difficult work feel lighter. Those who had known her in the early days, when she'd been a hollow shell in black mourning dress, marveled at the transformation. But Josephine never forgot what it had cost her to find her way back to joy. She made a point of reaching out to others who were grieving, offering comfort and understanding without trying to rush their healing. "You can't force someone to laugh again," she told Cade one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. "But you can remind them that laughter is still possible. That's what you did for me." "You did the hard work yourself," Cade said, pulling her close. "I just pestered you until you were ready to try. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. That's not pestering. That's grace." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to their children's shrieks of joy as they chased fireflies through the gathering dusk. Matthew was helping Grace and David catch the glowing insects in jars, his serious face intent on the task. Grace was laughing her wild, fearless laugh. David was singing a nonsense song to himself. "We made something good here," Josephine said softly. "Something beautiful. Out of grief and loss and pain, we made this." "We did," Cade agreed. "And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the part where I barely talked to you for weeks, even that. Every moment that led to this moment was worth it." Josephine turned and kissed him, and even after years of marriage, the touch of her lips still sent warmth through his entire body. When they broke apart, she was smiling, her eyes bright with love and mischief. "Race you to catch a firefly," she said suddenly, standing up. "What?" "Josephine, we're adults," but she was already running down the porch steps, her skirts hiked up, laughing as she joined their children in the yard. Cade watched for a moment, his heart swelling with love, then jumped up and followed her. They ran through the yard together, all 5 of them, catching fireflies and filling jars with gentle glowing light. The children squealed with delight, and Josephine's laughter rang out clear and true across the desert evening. Cade caught her around the waist and spun her in a circle, both of them breathless and happy. When he set her down, she cupped his face in her hands and looked at him with such love that he felt it like a physical force. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For my life, for my laughter, for all of this. Thank you for letting me love you, for trusting me, for building this life with me. Always," she promised, "for always." The years continued to unfold, bringing changes and challenges and joys. Matthew went off to university in San Francisco, determined to become a lawyer. Grace married a kind rancher and moved to a spread north of Eureka. David stayed close to home, helping Cade run the ranch and eventually taking it over completely. Through it all, Cade and Josephine remained devoted to each other. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their movements slowing, but their love never diminishing. And Cade never stopped making Josephine laugh. Even in their later years, when they spent quiet evenings on the porch watching sunsets, he would still tell her jokes and funny stories, still make ridiculous observations designed to coax that bright laughter from her. And she would oblige him, her laugh growing softer with age but never losing its genuine joy. Sometimes, on clear nights, they would talk about the early days, about how broken Josephine had been, how patient Cade had been, how uncertain their future had seemed. "Did you really think you could fix me?" Josephine asked one evening when she was 72 and he was 76. "I never thought you needed fixing," Cade replied, his voice creaky but strong. "I just thought you needed reminding." That joy was still possible, that laughter was still there, waiting for you to find it again. "You found it for me. We found it together." Josephine leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, holding hands the way they had for nearly 4 decades. Around them, their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Grace's daughter was teaching David's sons how to catch fireflies, just as they'd all been taught. "I'm glad I laughed that day by the creek," Josephine said softly. "Glad I took that risk, let myself feel again. Me too, darling, me too. And I'm glad a stubborn cowboy Marshal decided to make it his mission to hear that laugh every day. Best mission I ever took on." They sat together as the sun set and the stars came out, the sounds of their family's laughter surrounding them like music. And in that moment, everything felt complete, full circle, perfect. Josephine had been afraid she'd forgotten how to laugh, that she'd lost it forever along with her first family. But Cade had shown her that laughter wasn't something you could lose permanently. It was always there, waiting to be rediscovered. All you needed was someone patient enough to help you find it again, and brave enough to love you through the search. And once found, that laughter became the foundation for everything else. For healing, for new love, for a future that honored the past without being trapped by it. For a life full of joy and purpose and endless small moments of grace. As the evening deepened and the children were called inside, Cade and Josephine remained on the porch, holding hands and watching the stars emerge one by one. They didn't need to speak. After so many years together, words were often unnecessary. But finally, Josephine broke the silence. "Tell me something funny," she said, the way she had so many times before. Cade thought for a moment, then said, "Remember that time Grace tried to ride the pig and ended up in the water trough?" Josephine laughed, the sound warm and rich despite her age. She was convinced she could train it to be a mount, so determined. Got that from her mother. "I was never that ridiculous. No, you were worse. Remember when you tried to teach Matthew to sew and ended up with thread tangled everywhere, including in your hair? That was an accident. That was hilarious." They laughed together, trading memories and stories, their voices growing quieter as the night grew deeper. Eventually, they went inside to their bedroom, helping each other with the small tasks that had grown more difficult with age. When they finally lay down together, Cade pulled Josephine close, her head on his shoulder the way it had been for thousands of nights before. "I love you," he said, as he did every night. "I love you too," she replied, as she always did. "Thank you for my laughter, Cade Emerson. Thank you for sharing it with me, Josephine Emerson." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. Photos of their children and grandchildren covered the walls. Quilts made by Josephine's hands covered the bed. Cade's old Marshal's star sat on the dresser, polished and proud. And in the morning, when they woke to another day, Cade would make Josephine laugh again. Because that was his mission, his purpose, his greatest joy. To hear the laughter of the woman who'd been afraid she'd forgotten how. The woman who'd learned to live again through love and patience and countless small moments of grace. They had many more years together, growing old with dignity and love, surrounded by family and friends. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, welcomed great-grandchildren, and watched Eureka grow and change around them. And through it all, every single day without exception, Cade found a way to make Josephine laugh. It was his promise, his mission, his love made manifest. And she gave him her laughter freely, that bright, joyful sound that had once seemed lost forever, but had been waiting all along to be rediscovered. When Cade finally passed away at the age of 84, peacefully in his sleep with Josephine by his side, she wept. But she also laughed, remembering all the joy he'd brought her. All the ridiculous jokes and silly faces and tender moments of humor that had defined their life together. At his funeral, she told stories that made everyone laugh through their tears. Stories about Napoleon the rooster and the water trough, about firefly catching and pig riding and 1,000 other small, perfect moments. She honored his memory not with solemn sadness, but with the laughter he'd worked so hard to restore in her. And when it was her turn 5 years later to leave this world and join him in whatever came next, she went with a smile on her face. Her last words, spoken to her gathered children and grandchildren, were simple and true. "He taught me to laugh again," she said, "and that made all the difference." She closed her eyes then, still smiling, and slipped away peacefully. And those who loved her liked to think that the first thing she heard in whatever lay beyond was Cade's voice, telling her some ridiculous joke, making her laugh that bright, beautiful laugh one more time. Because some missions don't end with death. Some promises echo into eternity. And the love between Cade and Josephine, built on patience and humor and the rediscovery of joy, was the kind that transcended everything. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the stories told about them, in the way they'd shown everyone around them that healing was possible, that laughter could be found even in the darkest grief. They were buried side by side in the cemetery outside Eureka, beneath the vast Nevada sky they'd both loved. And on both their headstones, along with their names and dates, was a simple epitaph that captured the essence of their love story. For Cade, he made it his mission to bring joy. For Josephine, she learned to laugh again. And in the years that followed, young couples in Eureka would visit those graves, standing hand in hand before the weathered stones, listening to the stories of the marshal and the widow. The woman who'd been afraid she'd forgotten laughter, and the cowboy who'd made it his mission to hear it every day. Their story became legend in that small Nevada town, passed down through generations. A reminder that love could heal, that patience could overcome grief, that laughter was never truly lost as long as someone cared enough to help you find it again. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind blew through Eureka, and the sun set behind the mountains in shades of gold and purple, people swore they could hear it. Faint but clear, carried on the breeze, the sound of a woman laughing, bright and joyful and free. The sound of a promise kept, a mission fulfilled, a love that had conquered everything, even death itself, because Josephine had learned to laugh again. And Cade had spent every day of his life making sure she never forgot how. That was their legacy. Not wealth or fame or power, but something far more valuable. The knowledge that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the most profound grief could give way to joy, that love and laughter and patience could transform lives in ways both subtle and profound. And in the end, that was everything that mattered. The laughter of one woman, hard-won and precious. The devotion of one man, steadfast and true. And the life they'd built together, one laugh, one day, one moment of joy at a time, until their story became a testament to the enduring power of love in all its forms.